Welcome to Thought Frontier.
Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at something, it's kind of a mouthful, but it's really interesting. It's the relationship between industrial activity and environmental risks, and specifically how those collide with social vulnerability. By the end of this deep dive, you'll understand how researchers are identifying these hot spots, where these factors all come together, and how they measure those risks and what it all means for communities. And not just one specific community. We're talking about all over the world in places like Spain, Argentina, Bolivia.
Yeah, it's fascinating how interconnected these issues really are. I mean, we often talk about poverty and environmental damage as if they're separate problems, but the reality is they're kind of locked in this vicious circle.
Yeah, that vicious circle idea is a little unsettling, isn't it? It's almost like a trap.
It is. Imagine a community that's struggling with poverty. They might be forced to make choices that harm the environment just to survive. Things like unsustainable farming practices that lead to deforestation or soil erosion. And then that environmental damage makes it even harder for them to escape poverty. Research shows that this is happening, that environmental damage is further pushing communities into poverty in something like 70% of developing nations. So it's this cycle that's incredibly difficult to break.
So it's not just about lack of resources, right? It's about the system that keeps both poverty and environmental harm going. Now, you mentioned unsustainable farming practices in rural areas. What about urban environments? How does all of this play out in cities?
Well, in cities, you often see a concentration of polluting industries, and they tend to be located in or near impoverished neighborhoods. In these communities, they might lack the resources or the political influence to demand stricter environmental regulations. So sometimes it comes down to a really tough choice. They have to choose immediate jobs, even if those jobs are in polluting industries, or the long-term health risks that come with those industries.
Yeah, that's such a tough trade-off to have to make. It really highlights how connected these issues are. I mean, we can't really talk about pollution without talking about social and economic inequalities. So let's get into these hotspots. How do researchers actually find these areas where industrial risk and social vulnerability kind of collide?
Well, they look for areas where there's a lot of polluting industries that overlap with communities that are facing, significant social and economic challenges, and to measure a community's resilience, or I guess vulnerability in this case. They use something called the Social Vulnerability Index.
That sounds pretty complex. What exactly goes into calculating something like that?
Yeah, it takes into account a bunch of factors. We're talking poverty levels, access to health care, education levels, even a community's age distribution, and how much social cohesion there is. It's essentially a way to figure out how well a community can handle and recover from different shocks, including environmental ones.
So on one hand, we have this social vulnerability index to understand what's happening in the community. What about the industry side of things? What makes some industries riskier than others in these calculations?
Well, that's where it gets interesting. It's not just about what an industry produces, like whether it's chemicals or textiles or whatever. It's also about the size of the operation. And there's actually a really interesting finding here. Smaller businesses, while they may not pollute as much individually, can actually create a bigger problem overall when there's a lot of them in one area.
That seems kind of counterintuitive. Why would smaller businesses pose a greater threat than larger industries? Wouldn't bigger factories mean more pollution?
You'd think so, right. But smaller factories often don't have the resources or the oversight to control pollution properly. Think about it like this. If one of your neighbors is playing loud music, it's annoying. But if your whole block is having a party and everyone's blasting music, that's a whole other level of noise. And it's the same idea with pollution. The combined effect of lots of small polluters can be really significant. And a lot of times traditional risk assessments miss this.
So it's not just about how big the factory is, but about how many smaller polluters are in a certain area. Now, the research mentions Argentina as a case study for this type of analysis. What makes Argentina a good example for this kind of research?
Well, Argentina has a lot of different industries, and they're spread out across all these different environments. It's a really good example of the global challenges that we're talking about.
And how did researchers actually measure how hazardous the industries were in Argentina? Did they just look at how much they were emitting overall?
They went a little deeper than that. They looked at emissions per employee. So they factored in the size of each plant and what kind of industry it was. And that gave them a more accurate picture of what they call pollution intensity.
Pollution intensity, what exactly does that mean?
Basically, it's how concentrated the pollution is.
Yeah.
A large factory might have higher emissions overall, but their pollution might be less concentrated because they have things like higher smokestacks, that spread the pollutants out over a wider area. But smaller factories often release pollutants much closer to the ground, so they have a bigger impact on the immediate surroundings.
So even the height of a smokestack can impact the risk to nearby communities. Who knew? What did they find in Argentina? Did the research support the idea that bigger factories pollute more?
It was actually the opposite. What they found in Argentina was that small and medium-sized firms, especially when there's a lot of them concentrated in one place, can actually be a bigger risk to the people nearby compared to those larger plants that are more heavily regulated. So it really shows that we need to look at the combined impact of all these polluters and not just focus on the big ones.
That's a really important takeaway. So we have the social vulnerability index to assess the communities and a way to measure how dangerous the industries are. How do researchers actually put all of that information together to make those hotspot maps?
They use something called Geographic Information Systems, or GIS, to create maps that combine all of that data. The social data and the industrial data. It's basically like a heat map that shows you where the high social vulnerability and the high industrial hazardousness overlap.
I'm already picturing those maps, with those big red zones highlighting the areas we should be most concerned about.
Yeah, they're very powerful images. And the research actually shows maps for Argentina, Bolivia, and Spain, and they all have these unique patterns. But what's great about these maps is that you can instantly see where the help is most needed.
So tell us more about what they found in those different countries. What are some of the similarities or differences in where these hotspots show up?
Well, in Argentina, a lot of hotspots are concentrated around Buenos Aires, which makes sense. There's a huge population there and a lot of industries. In Bolivia, the city of Santa Cruz de la Sierra, which is a big industrial hub, is also facing major challenges.
What about Spain? You'd think that a more developed country would have a better handle on these problems.
You think so. And to a certain extent, they do. But even Spain has regional disparities. Cities like Madrid and Seville, while they're not as extreme as some areas in Bolivia or Argentina, they still have pockets where the risk is concentrated, which shows that even developed nations have work to do.
It's really fascinating how those maps show those inequalities, even in a country like Spain.
Yeah, it's really powerful. And that's why these maps are so valuable. They give policymakers and communities a clear picture of where to focus their efforts. But it's not enough to just know where the risks are. We have to understand whether a country can actually do something about them.
And that brings us to governability. What does that even mean in this context?
Governability is basically a society's ability to manage and reduce these risks.
So it's that connection between understanding the problem and actually fixing it.
Exactly. And this is where things get a bit more complicated. Research has actually found a gap between what they call evaluated risk, which is what those maps show us, and managed risk, which is what's actually happening on the ground. And that gap is often affected by how well a country is governed.
So just because we can see a hotspot on a map doesn't necessarily mean that it's being addressed effectively.
Unfortunately, that's often the case. The research highlights some challenges that are particularly prevalent in Latin America. For example, it can be hard to get consistent data on industrial emissions. Environmental regulations might not be as strong or as consistently enforced, and social inequalities can create barriers to effective risk management.
Wow, there's so many layers to this issue. It's not just about finding the hotspots, but about understanding a country's ability and willingness to actually do something about it. I think this is a good place to pause and think about what we've learned before we jump into potential solutions.
Yeah, it really is a complex problem. But the good news is that researchers are doing more than just mapping these hotspots. They're looking at ways to fix it, to bridge that gap we were talking about.
That's good to hear. Now, the outline mentioned that we have some firsthand accounts. Did any of those sources give us any insight into what's being done to actually address these hotspots?
Yes, and those firsthand accounts are so valuable. One researcher, Annabelle Calvo, she focuses on environmental risk in Argentina, and she highlighted something really important: community engagement. It's not enough to just have regulations. You need to involve the people who are living in these hotspots.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, who knows the risks and challenges better than the people who are dealing with them every day?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Calvo's research really emphasizes the need to understand the specific needs of each community and to give them the power to be a part of the solution. And that often starts with education and awareness.
So it's about helping them understand the connection
between
industrial activity and their environment and their own health so they can actually advocate for change.
Precisely. It's about giving communities the knowledge and tools to hold industries and policymakers accountable. Another expert, Kajal Eric Bugya, who's worked a lot on sustainable development, he agrees with this idea of community-driven change. He says that to address these hotspots, we need everyone to work together: the communities, the policymakers, the industries, and the researchers.
I really like that idea of a collaborative approach. It's not something that any one group can solve on their own, is it?
Nope. It takes communication, a shared commitment, and a willingness to find solutions that work for everyone, for the environment and the community.
So we've got community empowerment, awareness raising, collaboration. Those are all really important. But what about the more practical side of things? Are there any specific strategies that are being used to manage these risks?
Well, Bug suggests using those GIS maps we talked about, not just to identify the hot spots, but to help make decisions.
So you're saying those maps can help target resources and efforts more effectively?
Exactly. Policymakers can use those maps to figure out where to invest in things like pollution control technology, infrastructure improvements, or social programs that can help reduce vulnerability, specifically in those high-risk areas.
Now, that's really interesting. Those maps are going beyond just showing us the problem. They're helping us figure out what to do about it. Did the research mention any other practical tools or strategies?
There's a really interesting example from Spain. They have a law called the Law of Environmental Responsibility.
Yeah.
And it basically requires industries to put up financial guarantees to cover the cost of any potential environmental damage they might cause.
So it's like an insurance policy to make sure someone is held accountable if something goes wrong.
Exactly. It creates a system where there are both incentives and consequences to encourage more responsible behavior. And it shows how important it is to have clear regulations and a way to enforce them.
Because regulations without enforcement aren't really that useful.
Exactly. And to have effective enforcement, you need resources, political will, and often pressure from the community to make sure that those regulations are being followed.
Which brings us back to that idea of community engagement. It's not just about having rules, it's about having informed and active citizens who are pushing for change. What about the industries themselves? Are there any examples of businesses taking the initiative to reduce their impact on the environment?
Definitely. Corporate social responsibility is becoming really important. Some companies are doing more than just what's required by law. They're investing in cleaner technology, reducing their emissions, and partnering with communities to address social and environmental problems.
That's really encouraging. It sounds like some companies are realizing that sustainability is good for business, not just good for the planet.
Yeah, and more consumers are paying attention to this. They're demanding ethical and sustainable practices from the companies they support.
It's a win-win. Companies do the right thing, and it's good for their bottom line.
Absolutely. And that's a powerful motivator. But it's not just about the big corporations. Smaller businesses can make a difference too. Remember when we talked about how the combined impact of smaller firms can be significant?
Right. Even small changes can add up, especially if they're happening on a larger scale.
Exactly. This is where things like industry associations and networks can play a big role. They can help smaller companies learn about best practices, share resources, and advocate for policies that support sustainability across entire industries.
So that collaboration we talked about is important for businesses too. It's great to see how it all ties together.
It really does. It shows how interconnected all of these challenges are. Everyone has a role to play. Governments, communities, industries, we all have to work together. But as we're talking about solutions, it's important to remember that this issue is bigger than just industrial pollution.
That's a good point. We've been focusing on industrial hotspots, but it feels like this framework, this idea of overlapping vulnerabilities, could be applied to a lot of different issues. It does feel like we need to zoom out a little bit. We've been talking about industrial pollution, but you're saying that this hotspot framework, this idea of vulnerabilities overlapping, could apply to a lot of other things too.
Yeah, definitely. Think about climate change, for example. Industrial activities contribute a lot to greenhouse gas emissions. And we already know that climate change is hitting the most vulnerable communities the hardest.
It's like it's making the problem even worse. The hotspots we've been talking about, where social vulnerability and industrial hazards are already a problem, they're probably going to be the most affected by climate change as well.
Exactly. We're talking about rising sea levels, extreme weather, droughts, heat waves. All of these things can make existing inequalities even worse and create new vulnerabilities. And it's often the communities with the least resources that are hit the hardest.
That's a really tough reality. So understanding these hotspots, the things that cause them, and how vulnerable they are to climate change becomes even more important, right?
Absolutely. This framework, this way of thinking about these converging risks can be applied to so many other challenges: healthcare, housing, even the spread of diseases. It's about understanding that vulnerability doesn't usually exist in isolation. It's usually the result of a bunch of different factors all coming together.
So this deep dive into industrial hotspots
Yeah.
has actually given us a way to understand all sorts of complex problems.
Exactly. And it's not just about global issues either. This framework can be applied to your own community, your neighborhood, even your own life. Think about the hotspots around you, the places where different risks are converging, and what can be done to reduce those risks and build more resilient communities.
That's a great point. You've given us a lot to think about. It's like a call to action. Look around, identify those vulnerabilities, and figure out how we can work together to make things better, to create a more just and equitable world.
That's what it's all about. Recognizing that these challenges are all connected and working together to create positive change.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from mapping those industrial hotspots to exploring solutions and understanding how this framework can be applied more broadly. We'll be sure to include links to the research we discussed in the show notes so you can learn more. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions, keep learning, and keep diving deep.